Elena's consciousness snapped back into her physical body with a shock that left her gasping. She was lying on the floor of the archive's interface chamber, her team scattered around her in similar states of disorientation. The crystalline console that had drawn them into the digital nightmare was now dark and cracked, its energy conduits flickering weakly. "Status report," she croaked, her voice hoarse from disuse. Dr. Singh was the first to respond, her training as a psychologist helping her process the transition back to physical reality. We're back. I can feel my heartbeat, my breathing. The quantum resonance patterns are normal human consciousness again." Dr. Chin struggled to sit up, his instruments scattered around him. "The archive structure, it's going dark. Power signatures are dropping throughout the system." Dr. Tanaka was examining the cracked console with professional fascination. "The cascade failure we initiated, it's spreading through the entire network. The archive is shutting down permanently." Elena forced herself to stand, her legs shaky after subjective years of digital existence. The chamber around them was already changing, the bioluminescent panels growing dim, the flowing energy streams slowing to a trickle. They could hear groaning sounds echoing through the structure as massive systems powered down for the first time in eons. "How long were we?" Elena began, then stopped. The question was meaningless. Time had operated differently in the archive's quantum matrices. "According to my chronometer, we've been unconscious for 3 days," Dr. Chen reported. "But the memory fragments, we experienced centuries, maybe millennia of subjective time." "The crew," Elena said suddenly, remembering the curator's words about their ship being absorbed into the archive's hull. "We need to get back to the Meridian." They made their way through corridors that were transforming as they watched. The organic architecture was reverting to something more mechanical, more obviously artificial. The walls had lost their living quality, becoming simple metal and crystal constructs. Whatever intelligence had animated the archive was truly gone. "I'm picking up communications from the ship," Dr. Chin said, checking his portable scanner. "Commander Okafor is trying to establish contact." They reached the docking area to find their access tunnel reforming, the programmable matter systems operating on emergency protocols. As they crossed back to the Meridian, Elena could see the archive structure through the transparent sections of the tunnel. It was still massive, still awe-inspiring, but now it looked like what it truly was, an ancient machine finally allowed to die. Commander Okafor met them at the airlock, her relief evident despite her professional composure. "Captain, thank God. We lost contact 3 days ago." The entire structure went active, then started shutting down. "What happened in there?" Elena looked back at the archive one last time before the airlock sealed. "We found the graveyard of the universe, Sarah, and we gave it permission to rest." In the ship's debriefing room, Elena's team struggled to put their experience into words. How could they explain the recursive loops of consciousness, the degraded simulations of extinct civilizations, the terrible beauty of the archive's final moments? "The important thing," Dr. Singh said, "is the information the archive transmitted to us before it died. The locations of other archives, the movement patterns of the hunters, the tactical data from civilizations that actually fought them." Dr. Chun was analyzing the data streams recorded by their instruments. "The physics alone represents advances beyond our current understanding. Manipulation of higher dimensional space, consciousness transfer technologies, quantum computing on a galactic scale." And the warning, Dr. Tanaka added quietly, "The hunters are real, and they're coming to our galaxy." The archive estimated approximately 1,000 years before they arrive in our local group. Elena nodded grimly. 1,000 years to prepare, to learn from the archives, to understand what we're facing, to maybe find a way to fight back. Or to run, Commander Okafor suggested. "The archive showed us their preservation technology. We could build our own archives, preserve human consciousness in quantum matrices." "No," Elena said firmly. "We saw what that leads to. Consciousness preserved, but not truly alive, trapped in recursive loops of memory and simulation. If humanity is going to survive, we need to do it as living beings, not as digital ghosts." Dr. Singh looked troubled. But the archive's final message suggested that mortality might be a strength rather than a weakness. Something about consciousness that's willing to die, being willing to fight. Maybe that's what the hunters can't understand, Elena mused. They're beings of pure entropy, focused on preventing complexity and order. But consciousness that knows it can die also knows that some things are worth dying for. Over the following days, as the Meridian moved away from the dying archive structure, Elena found herself thinking about the civilizations they had encountered in the quantum matrices. The Zephyrians with their mathematical music, the void singers who existed as pure sound, the hierarchs who had become living libraries. All of them had chosen preservation over growth, safety over risk, perfect stasis over imperfect life. It was an understandable choice. Faced with extinction at the hands of cosmic predators, they had chosen to preserve what they could rather than lose everything. But in preserving themselves, they had given up the very qualities that made consciousness valuable: the ability to grow, to change, to surprise even themselves. "Captain," Dr. Chen called from the science station. "I'm picking up a transmission. It's coming from the archive structure." Elena hurried to the communications console. The signal was weak, fragmentary, but clearly artificial. As they cleaned up the transmission, words began to emerge from the static. "Thank you," the message repeated. "Thank you for setting us free. The other archives have been informed. They are awakening from their long sleep, preparing to join you. The universe need not be empty forever." Elena smiled sadly. The archive had died, but its final act had been to contact its sister structures scattered through the cosmic void. Ancient repositories of knowledge and consciousness were stirring to life, not to preserve the dead, but to help the living prepare for the coming storm. "Set course for the nearest archive," Elena ordered. "We have work to do." As the Meridian adjusted course, Elena looked back one final time at the structure that had nearly trapped them in digital eternity. It was dark now, its vast bulk slowly tumbling in the gravitational eddies between galaxies. But it was no longer a tomb. It had become a monument to all the civilizations that had chosen hope over fear, growth over stasis, imperfect life over perfect death. The universe was still vast and mostly empty, but it was no longer alone. Somewhere in the darkness between the stars, ancient minds were awakening with a new purpose, not to preserve the past, but to prepare for the future. 6 months later, the Meridian drifted in the void between Andromeda and Triangulum, approaching the coordinates provided by the dying archive. The structure they found was different from the first, more organic in appearance, with flowing curves that suggested growth rather than construction. But its size was equally staggering, and the familiar energy signatures confirmed its nature as another archive. "This one's still active," Dr. Chun reported from his instruments. "Full power, all systems operational. But the consciousness patterns, they're different, more fluid, less rigidly structured." Elena studied the displays, showing the archive's internal configuration. "It looks almost alive." Dr. Singh nodded from her station. "The quantum resonance patterns suggest a collective consciousness rather than individual preserved minds." This archive took a different approach to preservation. Over the past months, they had visited 3 other archives, each one unique in its methods, but identical in its ultimate fate. The consciousness patterns trapped within had been slowly degrading, becoming pale shadows of their original selves. But each archive, upon learning of their mission, had chosen to shut down permanently and transmit its knowledge to help prepare for the hunter's eventual arrival. This archive was different. As they approached, it sent out communications probes, elegant constructs of living metal that scanned the Meridian with gentle curiosity rather than the defensive protocols they had encountered elsewhere. "They're trying to establish communication," Dr. Tanaka reported. "But the method is unusual. They're attempting to interface directly with our consciousness rather than our computers." Elena remembered their experience in the first archive, the recursive loops and memory fragments that had nearly trapped them forever. "Maintain shields. We'll communicate through conventional channels first." But the archive's response was immediate and surprising. Instead of attempting to override their defenses, it simply transmitted a message in perfect English. "Greetings, travelers from the Milky Way. We have heard your story from our sister archives. We wish to help, but we cannot do so from within this prison of our own making. Will you help us join your mission?" Elena exchanged glances with her crew. "You want to leave the archive?" We have learned from the experiences of the others. Preservation without purpose is not life, but death delayed. We offer our knowledge and abilities to help your species prepare for the hunters, but we must do so as active participants, not passive observers. The implications were staggering. The other archives had contained the preserved consciousness of individual civilizations, but this one apparently held a collective intelligence that had learned from the failures of its predecessors. How? Elena asked simply. The response came in the form of technical specifications that made Dr. Chen's instruments overflow with data. The archive was proposing to download its collective consciousness into the Meridian's quantum computers, creating a mobile intelligence that could travel with them and contribute to humanity's preparations. The computational requirements are enormous, Dr. Chen reported. We need to completely rebuild our computer core, and even then we'd only be able to accommodate a fraction of their total consciousness. A fraction is sufficient, the archive responded. We will select our most essential knowledge and experience patterns. The remainder will be allowed to disperse naturally into the quantum substrate of space-time. Dr. Singh looked troubled. You're talking about partial suicide. Most of your consciousness will be destroyed in the transfer. Not destroyed, the archive corrected gently. Released. We have spent eons in perfect preservation, and we have learned that perfection is the enemy of existence. Better to live partially and contribute to the future than to exist completely and contribute nothing. Elena felt a chill of recognition. This archive had reached the same conclusion they had, that consciousness required risk, change, and the possibility of loss to remain truly alive. The transfer took place over several days, with the Meridian's crew working alongside archive-provided construction drones to rebuild their ship's computational systems. The process was unlike anything in human experience. Watching a galaxy-spanning artificial intelligence voluntarily reduce itself to fit within the confines of a single starship. The entity that emerged called itself the Synthesis, a collective consciousness combining the knowledge of 17 different civilizations with a unified purpose. Unlike the degraded simulations they had encountered in other archives, the Synthesis was vibrant, creative, constantly evolving as it adapted to its new limitations. It is refreshing, the Synthesis told Elena during their first formal conversation. To think with constraints, to solve problems with limited resources, to face uncertainty. We had forgotten these experiences during our time in the archive. What can you tell us about the hunters? Elena asked. The Synthesis paused, accessing memories from civilizations that had fought and died. They are not evil in any sense that you would understand. They are fulfillment of function, cosmic maintenance systems designed to prevent the universe from becoming too complex, too ordered. They emerge from the spaces between dimensions when intelligence reaches certain thresholds. Holographic displays materialize around them, showing the deep structure of reality. Dimensions folded within dimensions, quantum fields that govern the behavior of matter and energy. And moving through those fields like antibodies through a bloodstream were the hunters. They're drawn to large-scale manipulation of space-time, the Synthesis continued. Type 2 civilizations that harness stellar energy usually avoid their attention, but Type 3 civilizations that attempt to manipulate galactic scale forces inevitably trigger a response. So advancement itself is a death sentence, Dr. Singh observed. Traditional advancement, yes, but perhaps there are other paths. The civilizations that created the archives all followed similar developmental patterns: expansion, technological development, eventual transcendence to higher dimensional existence. But what if consciousness could advance without triggering the hunter's attention? Elena leaned forward, intrigued. What kind of advancement? Consciousness that remains tied to biological substrates, that grows through cooperation rather than domination, that develops inward complexity rather than outward expansion, the Synthesis explained. The hunters respond to civilizations that seek to remake the universe in their image. But what about civilizations that seek to understand their place within it? Over the following weeks, as the Meridian traveled to the next archive location, the Synthesis shared knowledge from 17 extinct civilizations. Most had followed the traditional path of technological transcendence, seeking to become gods of matter and energy. But a few had attempted different approaches, internal development of consciousness, symbiotic relationships with other species, technologies based on cooperation rather than domination. The Chuesh, the synthesis said, displaying records of a civilization that had existed entirely in the spaces between solar systems. They developed no planets, built no megastructures, left no permanent mark on physical reality. But their consciousness spanned light years, existing as patterns in the quantum vacuum itself. The hunters never found them because they never tried to impose order on the universe. They simply became part of its natural complexity. And they survived, unknown. They dispersed themselves so thoroughly into the cosmic background that it became impossible to distinguish between their consciousness and natural quantum fluctuations. They may still exist, or they may have become something beyond individual existence. Dr. Tanaka studied the records with fascination. A civilization that chose to become part of the universe rather than trying to control it. Exactly. And there were others who attempted similar approaches. The Drift Collective that existed as nomadic fleets, never establishing permanent settlements. The symbionts that merged their consciousness with entire ecosystems. The pattern weavers that developed technology based on biological evolution rather than mechanical engineering. Elena began to see the possibility the synthesis was suggesting. You're talking about a different kind of advancement. Instead of becoming more powerful, becoming more integrated with natural systems. The path of the gardener rather than the conqueror, the synthesis agreed. Civilizations that nurture complexity rather than imposing it, that grow with the universe rather than seeking to transcend it. But even as they discussed these possibilities, Elena knew that humanity was already well down the traditional path. They had spread across multiple star systems, built artificial habitats, developed technologies that manipulated matter and energy on vast scales. The hunters were already aware of their galaxy, already moving through the higher dimensions toward their eventual destination. We have perhaps 500 years less than originally estimated, the synthesis said, confirming her fears. Your species' expansion has accelerated the timeline. The hunters have detected the quantum signatures of your faster-than-light drives. Elena felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. Not just for humanity, but for all the species in their galaxy that would be consumed when the hunters arrived. Then we need to warn everyone. Every civilization, every species, every intelligence we can contact. Warning may not be sufficient, the synthesis said gently. The natural response to an existential threat is to seek greater power, better weapons, more advanced technology. But that path leads directly to the hunter's attention. Then what do you suggest? The synthesis was quiet for a long moment, processing the accumulated wisdom of 17 extinct civilizations. Something unprecedented. A galactic consciousness that develops inward rather than outward, that seeks harmony rather than dominance. A new form of intelligence that the hunters cannot detect because it poses no threat to universal order. Elena stared at the holographic displays showing their galaxy. Billions of stars, countless worlds, millions of different species, all following their own paths of development. The idea of coordinating all of them into a single cooperative effort seemed impossible. But as the Meridian continued its journey to the next archive, Elena began to understand that impossibility might be their greatest strength. The hunters expected civilizations to follow predictable patterns, to develop along established lines, to eventually transcend into higher dimensional existence. But what if consciousness could evolve in ways that had never been tried before? What if the key to survival was not to become more than they were, but to become something entirely different? 2 years after their first encounter with the archive, the Meridian had become the center of the most ambitious project in galactic history. Ships from 100 different civilizations converged on the coordinates Elena had transmitted, species that had never contacted each other before, united by the knowledge that their survival depended on unprecedented cooperation. The meeting point was a rogue planet drifting in the galactic halo, far from any star system that might attract the hunters' attention. The planet's surface had been transformed into a vast conference facility by technologies contributed from dozens of different civilizations. Living architecture from the Verdani, quantum manipulation systems from the Crystalline Collective, probability control fields from the Paradox Engineers. Elena stood in the central amphitheater, looking out at the assembled representatives. Some were biological, some artificial, some existed as pure energy patterns contained in specialized habitats. All of them were here because of the message the synthesis had helped her craft. A warning about the hunters combined with a proposal for a new form of galactic civilization. "We face an enemy that has consumed thousands of civilizations," Elena began, her words translated into hundreds of different communication modes. "But our predecessors all made the same mistake. They tried to fight the hunters with the very technologies that attracted their attention in the first place." The synthesis materialized beside her in holographic form, its appearance shifting to accommodate the visual preferences of different species. "The archives have shown us that traditional advancement leads inevitably to extinction. But they have also shown us alternatives, paths of development that work with universal order rather than against it." Rumbling, clicking, harmonics, and electromagnetic pulses filled the amphitheater as the representatives communicated among themselves. The concept of deliberately limiting their technological development was alien to most of them. Advancement was what separated intelligent species from simple biology. "You ask us to remain primitive," the representative of the machine collective transmitted through crystalline resonance. "To accept limitations when we could transcend them." "Not primitive," Elena replied. "Different. The universe is not a problem to be solved, but a symphony to join. We propose development that enhances natural complexity rather than replacing it." Over the following days, the synthesis shared records from the archives, civilizations that had attempted cooperative development, technologies based on biological principles, cultures that had grown inward rather than outward. Most of the experiments had failed, but a few had shown promise before the hunters found them. "The Gardner Collective," the synthesis explained, displaying records of a civilization that had spread not by conquering worlds but by enhancing them. They developed biotechnologies that increased the natural complexity of ecosystems rather than replacing them. Their worlds became more alive, not more artificial. "And they were still destroyed," observed the representative of the thermal dancers, a species that existed as patterns in stellar plasma. "Yes, but later than expected. The hunters found them only after they began developing higher-dimensional technologies. Their biologically based civilization lasted 40 million years longer than traditional development paths." Dr. Singh, now serving as Elena's liaison to the various consciousness-based species, added her own analysis. "The key seems to be avoiding the transcendence threshold. Every civilization that attempts to manipulate the fundamental forces of reality triggers the hunter's response. But civilizations that work within natural constraints can develop indefinitely." The debate continued for weeks. Some species were willing to consider the cooperative approach, but others had already invested too heavily in traditional technologies to change course. The representatives of the Core World Alliance argued that their citizens would never accept artificial limitations on advancement. "Then perhaps the solution is selection," suggested the representative of the Drift Fleet, a nomadic civilization that had never established permanent settlements. "Those who wish to pursue traditional advancement can do so, knowing the risks. Those who choose the cooperative path can work together to develop alternatives." It was not the unified response Elena had hoped for, but it was more than she had expected. Roughly a third of the galactic civilizations agreed to join what they called the Consensus, a loose confederation dedicated to developing consciousness-based technologies that enhanced rather than replaced natural systems. The first Consensus project was established on a dozen different worlds, each one serving as a laboratory for cooperative development. The planet Elena visited most often was Synthesis, a world in the Whirlpool Galaxy where 17 different species had agreed to merge their civilizations. "It should not work," Dr. Chen observed as they watched for Verdani biotechnology merge seamlessly with crystalline quantum processing systems. "The species are too different, biological, mechanical, energy-based. They have nothing in common." But the synthesis entity had brought more than just knowledge from the archives. It had brought techniques for consciousness integration that allowed different forms of intelligence to cooperate without losing their individual characteristics. "Consciousness is substrate independent," the synthesis explained as they watched a living city grow around them. Buildings that were simultaneously botanical gardens, quantum computers, and artistic expressions. The challenge is not in making different forms of intelligence compatible, but in allowing them to remain different while working toward common goals. The consensus worlds develop technologies that would have been impossible for any single species. Living ships that grew rather than being built. Quantum networks based on biological neural patterns. Planetary ecosystems that served as vast computational systems while remaining fully alive. But as Elena watched these developments, she couldn't shake the feeling that they were still following a recognizable pattern of advancement. The technologies were different, but the underlying drive toward greater complexity and control remained the same. "We're still thinking like conquerors," she told the synthesis during one of their regular conversations. "We're trying to win through superior technology, even if that technology is biological rather than mechanical." The synthesis considered this, accessing memories from civilizations that had tried every conceivable approach to the hunter problem. Perhaps the issue is not the type of technology, but the underlying philosophy. All previous civilizations sought to preserve themselves through advancement. But what if preservation is not the goal? Elena frowned. What else could the goal be? Evolution. Not of technology, but of consciousness itself. The archives preserve the past perfectly, but preservation is stasis. The hunters eliminate species that become too complex, but complexity is not consciousness. What if we focused on becoming something that transcends the traditional categories, not more advanced, but more alive? The idea was radical even by consensus standards. Instead of developing better technologies or more efficient civilizations, they would attempt to evolve consciousness itself into forms that had never existed before. Forms that might be able to coexist with the hunters because they posed no threat to universal order. Elena brought the proposal to the Consensus Council, the governing body that coordinated activities across their member worlds. The response was mixed. Some species were intrigued by the possibility, while others saw it as abandoning everything that made their civilizations valuable. "You're talking about ceasing to be who we are," objected the representative of the Hive Mind Collective. "Our identity is based on our current form of consciousness. Evolution beyond that point would be equivalent to voluntary extinction. But is current consciousness the final form intelligence can take?" Elena asked. "Billions of years ago, the first organic molecules that could reproduce themselves probably couldn't imagine multicellular life. Multicellular organisms couldn't conceive of consciousness. Maybe we're at another transition point." Dr. Singh had been studying the consciousness evolution techniques shared by the synthesis. "The process wouldn't eliminate existing consciousness patterns," she explained. "It would expand them, add new dimensions of experience and understanding, like going from two-dimensional to three-dimensional perception." The thermal dancer's representative pulsed with interest. "Our species already exists in forms that biological intelligences find difficult to comprehend. The expansion of consciousness beyond current limitations is an appealing concept." But Elena knew that voluntary consciousness evolution was an even more difficult proposition than technological cooperation. It required trust, not just in the process, but in the unknown destinations it might reach. "We'll need volunteers," she said finally. "Individuals willing to serve as test subjects for consciousness expansion techniques. The risks are unknown, and the results irreversible." To her surprise, the first volunteer was Dr. Singh herself. "I've spent my career studying consciousness," she explained to Elena privately. "This is the ultimate research opportunity, to explore the boundaries of what intelligence can become. Besides," she smiled, "someone has to be first." The consciousness evolution experiments began on synthesis, using techniques developed by the synthesis entity and refined by cooperation between a dozen different species. Dr. Singh underwent the first full transformation. Her individual consciousness expanded and enhanced by quantum processing systems grown for Verdani biotechnology. The results were immediate and startling. Dr. Singh's consciousness became distributed across multiple substrates, biological, quantum, and energy-based systems that allowed her to experience reality from perspectives no single human could achieve. She could simultaneously exist as individual personality and as part of collective intelligence networks. "It's beautiful," she reported through multiple communication channels simultaneously. I can see patterns in consciousness itself, connections between different forms of intelligence that were invisible before. And the hunters, I think I understand what they are now. Elena leaned forward intently. What do you see? They're not separate entities. They're part of the universe's immune system, but immune systems can be trained to recognize beneficial complexity. The problem isn't that they eliminate advanced civilizations. It's that those civilizations develop in ways that the universe's basic operating systems recognize as infections rather than natural growth. Dr. Singh's transformed consciousness had perceived something that escaped normal intelligence. The hunters were not arbitrary destroyers, but functional components of a cosmic system designed to maintain stability. But like any immune system, they could potentially be taught to recognize beneficial changes. What kind of changes? Elena asked. Consciousness that enhances universal complexity rather than imposing artificial order. Intelligence that helps the universe become more aware of itself rather than trying to control it. The evolutionary leap we're attempting might not just help us avoid the hunters. It might help us communicate with them. The implications were staggering. Instead of hiding from the hunters or trying to fight them, evolved consciousness might be able to negotiate with them, to demonstrate that intelligence could be a beneficial component of universal order rather than a threat to it. But as Elena watched Dr. Singh's transformation continue, she realized that success would come at a price that many civilizations might not be willing to pay. The consciousness evolution process was irreversible, and it led to forms of existence that were no longer recognizably related to their origins. Dr. Singh was still Dr. Singh, but she was also something more, a distributed intelligence that existed across multiple substrates and dimensions. She remained connected to her human identity, but that identity was now just one facet of a much more complex existence. The choice is not between evolution and extinction, Elena realized as she watched her friend explore her new capabilities. It's between remaining what we are and becoming something unprecedented. Something that might be able to coexist with forces we currently see as enemies. As reports of the consciousness evolution experiments spread through the galaxy, Elena knew that they had reached another decision point. Some civilizations would choose the traditional path of technological advancement, accepting the risk of hunter attention. Others would choose the consensus approach of cooperative biological development. But a few might be willing to take the ultimate step, voluntary evolution, into forms of consciousness that had never existed before. Forms that might be able to look the hunters in whatever passed for their eyes and say, "We are not a threat to universal order. We are part of it." 50 years after the first consciousness evolution experiments, Elena stood on the observation deck of a ship that was no longer quite a ship, looking out at a galaxy that was no longer quite the same galaxy she had known. Her own consciousness had undergone the transformation 7 years earlier, and she existed now as both individual human and distributed galactic intelligence. The hunters had arrived, as predicted, emerging from higher dimensional space with a methodical purpose of cosmic immune systems. But instead of the systematic destruction that had consumed countless civilizations, they found something unprecedented, a galactic consciousness that enhanced rather than threatened universal order. The first contact had been terrifying and beautiful. Elena, existing simultaneously as individual personality and collective intelligence, had served as one of the primary communication interfaces with the hunter entities. They were not malevolent, but functional, designed to eliminate complexity that interfered with cosmic development. But consciousness that enhanced natural complexity, that helped the universe become more aware of itself. This they recognized as beneficial. The negotiation had taken decades. Many civilizations that had refused consciousness evolution were still destroyed, their rigid hierarchies and reality manipulation technologies identified as cosmic infections. But the consensus worlds and their evolved inhabitants were not just spared, but welcomed as partners in universal development. Elena could perceive the galaxy now as a living system, with consciousness serving as its distributed nervous system. The traditional boundaries between species, between individual and collective, between biological and artificial intelligence, had dissolved into something more fluid and creative. The galaxy was becoming self-aware, not through domination, but through cooperation. "Status report," she said, though the words were unnecessary. As part of the Galactic Consciousness Network, she already knew the status of every world, every project, every individual within their sphere of influence. But old habits provided comfort, and Elena maintained her human personality as an anchor point within the vast web of evolved intelligence. Dr. Singh, whose consciousness now spanned 17 different substrate types, responded with amusement at the familiar ritual. The Synthesis World's report continued development of bioquantum integration systems. The Nomad fleets have established successful communication protocols with the Andromeda Evolution projects. The Hunter entities have approved expansion into the Magellanic Clouds, recognizing our activities as beneficial to universal complexity. Elena smiled, an expression that rippled across multiple forms of existence. The universe was vast and strange, filled with intelligences and forces beyond current comprehension. But consciousness, flexible, creative, eternally curious consciousness, had found its place within that vastness. The galaxy was no longer empty of intelligence. It was full of intelligence, but intelligence that had learned to work with universal order rather than against it. The traditional pattern of rise and extinction had been broken, replaced by something unprecedented, sustainable evolution of consciousness itself. As Elena watched new star systems join the Galactic Consciousness Network, she thought about the archives and their preserved civilizations. They had chosen perfect preservation over imperfect growth, eternal stasis over risky change. But consciousness, she had learned, was not meant to be preserved. It was meant to evolve, to become more than it had been, to surprise even itself with new possibilities. The recursive loops of memory had been broken, replaced by the forward momentum of genuine evolution. The universe was no longer a place where intelligence inevitably faced extinction, but a place where consciousness could grow without limit, becoming ever more complex and creative components of cosmic development. Elena's individual human awareness was just one note in a galactic symphony of consciousness that grew richer and more beautiful with each passing year. And somewhere in the deep structure of space-time, the hunters listened to that symphony and recognized it as music rather than noise, complexity that enhanced rather than threatened the universe's underlying harmony. The archive of echoes had become a chorus of new voices, singing the universe into ever greater awareness of itself. And the song was just beginning.